the author that we're going to bring up, she's the author of The Black Angels, which documents the history of Black nurses who cared for tuberculosis patients in New York during the tuberculosis epidemic. And these nurses, they played such a crucial role. The white nurses who had worked at this facility called Seaview, basically they said, we're not doing this. These are Black and brown immigrants. We can get better jobs. And so they recruited Black women from the South to come to Staten Island. And what is really interesting to me is that their efforts, I mean, first of all, their efforts were instrumental in developing the breakthrough on TB, but what they endured and the same issues that we went through in COVID and now we're seeing now with RFK in place are the same issues that the author documents. And right after we got, I reached out and I said, "Hey, can you be on the show?" And she confirmed we got news of the first confirmed tuberculosis case at a high school in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So when I say that things have, come full circle and that it could not be more timely, I think about that. And so I'm thrilled to invite on our show Maria Smilios, author of The Black Angels. Maria, welcome. Thrilled to
Thank you.
have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, I wish it wasn't so timely. I wish we weren't seeing so many parallels. But tell folks about the Black Angels. And full disclosure, my grandmother, part of how we connected is my
Mhm.
grandmother was a Black Angel. But tell people who they were and how you came to find their story, and then we can talk
Yes,
about the parallels between then and now.
I know it's so sad in a way that we've come to a moment in time when we're cycling backwards instead of cycling forwards, especially because they were instrumental in helping tuberculosis. I mean, it's a disease that's eradicable. So I'll tell you a little bit about these remarkable women. These were women who were in 1929 at Seaview Hospital. The white nurses, as Nadine mentioned, began quitting. And part of that was that white women at the time had many options for jobs that wouldn't kill them. So Seaview was left short staffed. It was the largest municipal sanatorium in New York City, and the predominant patient population were immigrants and African Americans from Harlem. These people were considered by the city, quote, immoral, uncouth, unprofessional, indigent consumptives. Second-class citizens sent to this woefully understaffed sanatorium on this island, 400 feet above sea level, to languish and die. This was a time when there was no antibiotics, nothing. It was just, they thought fresh air and sunshine. And I mean, no antibiotics for anything. And so when the nurses began leaving, the city had a choice: either staff the ailing hospital somehow or shut it down. If they shut it down, there would have been thousands of patients that would have converged on the city, spreading tuberculosis. So they decided what they were going to do was put out a call similar to the one that had called up sharecroppers and farmers from the South. And at the time, Black nurses could only work in Black hospitals. And so there were hundreds of them underemployed. And so the city put out a call and they offered them free pay, housing, a professional career, and as they saw it, a quote, rare opportunity to work in one of New York's municipal hospitals. A little fact here, only 4 of New York's 29 municipal hospitals were integrated at the time. And so these nurses came up because what they wanted most, as I say, was a professional career. And they wanted to rise above the math that said Black women could not have professional careers or own homes. And in their mind, they thought, if we come up and do this job, we will be considered, we could buy homes and we will be considered equal. That's not what happened. So they came up and they spent decades working at this hospital with people. So TB is not many people know much about tuberculosis. I know it's in the news now. TB is a grievous disease. It's called consumption because it consumes you from the inside out. This is not, as I say, the microbe is beautifully rendered to torture and kill slowly. So they took care of people who were there. I saw medical cards that said 800 days, 1,000 days, 3 straight years at Seaview. And eventually, they became part of one of the most galvanizing moments in human history, the cure for tuberculosis. And so that's kind of the story in a nutshell. There's much more that happens. I would, really urge you to read the story. As Nadine said, her grandmother was one of these Black angels, and they were really a remarkable group of women who were erased from history for 80 years. There was a whole narrative about tuberculosis that had been crafted without them. And, now they're starting to be folded into that narrative, and it makes me really, really happy.
Well, to me, so much of that story is about the courage of those nurses and the humanity, where they noticed things about their patients that the white nurses hadn't, because they weren't reading to them, sitting at their bedsides, holding their
Exactly.
hands, and they were able to see the how the different drugs were interacting, and it made such a difference. And now here we are at a time where we've got the heads of government, health agencies talking about autism registries, and Florida just passed a ban on fluoride, and you have, parents of a child who's died of measles saying they still wouldn't have gotten her a vaccine even if it could have saved her. How do what do you see as the parallels right now in this anti-science moment? These, people furious if you wear a face mask on a on a plane, all of this kind of anti-science. What did you see then that you think might be instructive to us now?
So it's I don't want to say it's funny that you mentioned the fluoride, because I was listening to RFK's idiotic statements about how fluoride makes kids stupid, which he made, I think, today, because there's so many that come out every single day. You lose track of when he says that. But I was just listening to that, and I thought to myself, I don't want to say how have we arrived at this moment, because I feel that we have been working towards this collective idiocracy for a long time. Um, there, there really are no parallels to the type of anti-science that we are seeing right now, because, as I say, the people that lived during this time that had no medications, and the first real antibiotics came in 1943 and 44 during World War II, sulfa packets given to soldiers to put in wounds. And this became the kind of golden age for antibiotics. And then in 1955, you had the polio vaccine. There was anti-science then. The world was not perfect. People pushed back. When the diphtheria vaccine came out, parents were hesitant to give it because the first one didn't work very well, but they did it. You know why? Because they saw what these diseases did. 1 in 3 people in the turn of the 20th century had tuberculosis. Then it went to 1 in 7. This was a disease that stirred people's deepest fears. So did measles. So did polio. I don't think people understand polio is incurable. It is not, if you recover from measles, you're lucky. Polio, you're done. You're pretty much going to be disfigured for the rest of your life if you survive. And I think part of this is that people don't know history. They don't know what these diseases did. Part of it is this, willful ignorance, this belief in anti-science that is kind of mind-boggling. We have drugs for these. It's proven that measles has saved tens of millions of lives, and we are going backwards in time. The parallels that I see are not so much with the anti-science. The parallels that I would say that I see is going to be how many people are going to die. That's really, and suffer needlessly, and back then you could say, well, they were suffering needlessly because the disease was getting them and there were no drugs. Now they're going to suffer needlessly because they're banning the drugs.
Yeah, I mean, it is so extraordinary. And Maria, thank you so much for coming on and for putting your book out into the world. As you point out, this is an unprecedented moment in modern American history to have this dominance of sort of this anti-science, anti-common sense a regime, basically. The recklessness of putting someone like RFK Jr. At the helm of HHS is just, it's unfathomable that A, he would be selected and nominated, and B, anyone like him who has these extreme views where he embraces discredited science is somehow given not just the helm of that department, but also some sort of um, not mandate, but but in essence the power to remake
Mhm.
our health law based
Mhm.
on based on claims that have been repeatedly debunked. You know,
Yeah.
the claims on fluoride from basically one study in Canada that was not replicable because it was a poorly constructed study that was in defiance of hundreds of other studies about fluoride. That's extraordinary. When I saw this happening, what I remembered immediately was from my work exposing the John Birch Society and how Charles Koch's father, Fred Koch, helped launch the John Birch Society, how Charles Koch helped fund and fuel the John Birch Society in the 1960s until 1967, was that the John Birch Society, which was a bunch of crackpots, people who believed they were picking up the McCarthy mantle to see communism everywhere, who claimed that Eisenhower was soft on communism, the leader, former NATO leader, commander, and the president of the United States, to claim that the Supreme Court was communist, to claim basically everything was a communist plot, and including fluoride. And that was then parodied in Dr. Strangelove, and Nadine, I think, has the quote handy. But it really is extraordinary to see that fringe, nutty set of
Yeah.
claims be embraced as policy in America in the year 2025. Nadine, do you have the quote? Do you want to share it?
Oh, yeah, you know what? I just encourage people to watch Doctor Strangelove. First of all, it's a great film, but also, I mean, it really was, Colonel Jack Ripper, who would go on and talk about fluoride as a communist plot and how they were coming after
Yes.
our precious fluids, our vital essence. And it was an absolute joke. But now we have RFK Jr. saying the same things with a straight face. And, and it's not a parody, but I think that part of what we're seeing right now is that we have been so successful at,
Mhm.
in eradicating, and vaccines have been so successful that people have no memory. Like, it's their great grandparents. And RFK Jr. does indeed look like Colonel J. Ripper. That just adds to the irony of it. But yeah, and I guess perhaps we're going to have to see a lot more death and harm. But I think they are also quite fine. Just like with tuberculosis, wealthy people went and sat in Adirondack chairs in the mountains and
Mhm.
got fresh air. And poor people, immigrants, black and brown people, were stacked like cordwood in places like Seaview. And so I think there's even a quote somewhere in your book from the medical director who essentially says,
Oh, yeah. You
"Yeah,
want me
go
to say
ahead.
that?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I
please
do
do."
wanted to say one thing about that there are, thinking about it, there are probably two parallels that will come from this. Number one is when you talked about that autism registry, tuberculosis was a heavily stigmatizing disease. So that type of stigma, racializing a disease, or not, autism is not a disease, but racializing diseases and microbes has been around for a very long time. The idea that you want to create a registry for people with autism is going to do the same thing. It is along those same lines, to stigmatize and ostracize and other. The quote that Nadine is talking about is, in 1933, the president of hospitals held this big meeting in New York, and the nurses showed up. Some nurses from Seaview showed up, and one of the nurses was the head of what was called the incurable ward, and she stood up in front of city officials and supervisors and said, "Mr. President, why do you send Black nurses to Seaview?" And he said, quote, "The reason we send Black nurses to Seaview is because in 20 years we won't have a colored problem in America, because they'll all be dead from tuberculosis." The redeeming part of the book is that they don't die. Instead, they do something that is so, one in a million moment. The unredeemable part is the idea that these women were just as expendable as the people he sent there to languish and die. And that, in a nutshell, is what he is hoping to do, with saying people who are on, antidepressants are going to go to wellness camps, and he's going to go down the list, all kids with IEPs, that they're dismantling, the Board of Education departments that deal with children who have 504s or IEPs, kids who have like ADHD, ADD, or any kind of neurodiversity. That's what they're doing. So if you are not a white Christian male who probably has money, you're going to find yourself in some category. And one of the things that we can take away from this story is that if you don't think it can happen to you, disease doesn't care. It doesn't care who you are. It will happen. In time, it will happen, because the rapid untying of the whole healthcare system of America, I'm talking about in terms of vaccines and drugs that were used to mitigate diseases, is happening so fast that there's no way you're going to put a cap on it. The rate of TB spreading in this country right now is almost unprecedented. Like it's just kind of astonishing to sit back and watch this happen.
Unbelievable. And it does come for everyone. I think of Herman Cain, the Godfather pizza guy, bragging about being unvaccinated in crowds. And
I remember him, the
right,
999 guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
I haven't heard his name in a long, long time.
Yeah. And the research showed that the death rate among Republicans was actually higher because they were buying all of this. But as you say, we're all in this boat together, and they put themselves at risk and therefore put us all at risk. And it really is tragic. When you said that quote, I just felt my blood boil all over again. My father would tell the story of my grandmother coming home on the bus, sitting by herself. Nobody, she worked the late shift, and he would walk her from the bus stop, but couldn't get close, couldn't hold her hand. She would take all of her clothes and wash them immediately, shower before she would let any of the kids hug her. And there were, as you said in the book, that there were times when they would not let them wear masks.
Yeah, the supervisor believed. The supervisor was this Teutonic white woman who was the daughter of a Confederate medic, and she was a product of her time. And she believed she wasn't trained to wear masks. She came from one of the top infectious disease hospitals in the country, and she said specifically she would stalk the hallways to catch the Black nurses doing something wrong. And she said masks make the nurses complacent. And, she said they ball them up, they put them in their pocket. It wasn't disposable masks. It was these cloth gauze face coverings, whatever you want to call them. They were kind of the first masks that people wore, even though the studies were coming out that nurses who work with tuberculosis were at a higher risk of getting the disease, but a mask did prevent the spread. She didn't let them do that. So
she sounds like Nurse Ratched.
The nurses said, Miss Mitchell had a quote, gaze that could freeze the devil himself. She was completely like Nurse Ratched. But yeah, I mean, this is a story, in the end, I just, I feel like there's so much that we get pulled down and dragged down, but this book in particular, it is a story of triumph, and it is a story that gives us hope that there will always be people to take care of us, like Nadine's, grandmother, and all these other women who rose to these occasions. They did it again during COVID. But let's remember who these people were. These were Black and brown women who put their bodies on the line for us. And, that we keep asking them to do this is problematic, because the healthcare system is so stretched thin that there's not going to be, that's another thing, when you start reading the way nurses are being abused, there's not going to be anyone to take care of us when we get sick. It will happen. And I hate to say that so definitively, unless you have vaccines and you're fortunate enough to be vaccinated against measles, but there's no vaccine for TB. So that's a kind of roll of the dice.
Maria, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for uncovering this history and telling it so powerfully. How can people stay in touch with you?
They can go to my website, mariasmilios.com. There's my email is there. Feel free to reach out. Or follow me on social media. Thank you so much for having me. Have a great night. And
you too. You take care.
Talk soon. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.